was 11:15 when Kaufman got on the express through to Mott Avenue. He shared the car with two other travelers. One was a middle-aged black woman in a purple coat, the other a pale, acne-ridden adolescent who was staring at the "Kiss My White Ass" graffiti on the ceiling with spaced-out eyes. Kaufman was in the first car. He had a journey of 35 minutes duration ahead of him. He let his eyes slide closed, reassured by the rhythmic rocking of the train. It was a tedious journey, and he was tired. He didn't see the lights flicker off in the second car. He didn't see Mahogany's face either, staring through the door between the cars, looking through for some more meat. At 14th Street, the black woman got out. Nobody got in. Kaufman opened his eyes briefly, taking in the empty platform at 14th, then shut them again. The doors had closed. He was drifting in that warm somewhere between alertness and sleep, and there was a fluttering of nascent dreams in his head. It was a good feeling. The train was off again, rattling down the tunnels. Maybe, at the back of his dozing mind, Kaufman half registered that the doors between the first and second cars had been slit open. Maybe he smelt the sudden gush of tunnel air and registered that the noise of wheels was momentarily louder, but he chose to ignore it. Maybe he even heard the scuffle as Mahogany subdued the youth with the spaced-out stare, but the sound was too distant, and the promise of sleep was too tempting. He drowsed on. For some reason, his dreams were of his mother's kitchen. She was chopping turnips and smelling sweetly as she chopped. He was only small in his dream, and he was looking at her up at her with her radiant face while she worked. Chop, chop, chop. His eyes jerked open. His mother vanished. The car was empty, and the youth was gone. How long has he been dozing? He hadn't remembered the train stopping at West 4th Street. He got up, his head full of slumber, and almost fell over as the train rocked violently. It seemed to have gathered quite a substantial head of speed. Maybe the driver was keen to be home, wrapped up in bed with his wife. They were going at a fair lick. In fact, it was bloody terrifying. There was a blind drawn down over the window between the cars which hadn't been there before, as he remembered. A little concern crept into Kaufman's sober head. Suppose he'd been sleeping a long while, and the guard had overlooked him in the car. Perhaps they'd passed Far Rockaway, and the train was now speeding on its way to wherever they took the trains for the night. Fuck it, he said aloud. She could go forward and ask the driver. It was such a bloody idiot question to ask. Where am I? At this time of night, he was likely to get more than a stream of abuse by reply. Then the train began slow. A station. Yes, a station. The train emerged from the tunnel and into the dirty light of the station at West 4th Street. It missed no stops. So where had the boy gone? He'd either ignored the warning on his car forbidding transfer between cars while in transit, or he'd gone into the driver's cabin up front. Probably between the driver's legs even now, Kaufman thought, his lip curling. It wasn't even unheard of. This was Palace of Delights after all, and everyone had the right to get a little love in the dark. Kaufman shrugged himself. Nobody cared about where that boy had gone. Doors closed. Nobody had boarded the train. It shunted off from the station, lights flickering as it used a surge of power to pick up some speed again. Kaufman felt the desire for sleep to come over him afresh, but the sudden fear of being lost had pumped adrenaline to his system, and his limbs were tingling with nervous energy. His senses had sharpened too. Even over the chatter and the rumble of the wheels on the tracks, he heard the sound of tearing cloth coming from the next car. Was someone tearing their shirt off? He stood up, grasping one of the seat straps for balance. The window between the cars was completely curtained off, but he stared at it, frowning, as though he might suddenly discover X-ray vision. The car rocked and rolled. It was really traveling again. Another ripping sound. Was it rape? No more than a mild voyeuristic urge, he moved down the seesawing car towards the intersecting door, hoping there might be a chink in the curtain. His eyes were still fixed on the window. He failed to notice the splatters of blood he was treading until his heel slipped. He looked down. His stomach saw the blood before his brain, and the ham on the whole wheat was halfway on up his gullet, catching down in the back of his throat. Blood. He took several large gulps of stale air and looked away, back at the window. His head was saying, blood. Nothing would make the word go away. There was no more than a yard or two between him and the door now. He had to look. There was blood on his shoe, and a thin trail to the next car, but he had to look. He had to. He took 2 more steps to the door and scanned the curtain, looking for a flaw in the blind. A pulled thread in the weave would be sufficient. There was a tiny hole. He glued his eye to it. His mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing beyond the door. He rejected the spectacle as preposterous, as a dream sight. His reason said it couldn't be real, but his flesh knew it was. His body became rigid with terror. His eyes, unblinking, could not close off the appalling scene through the curtain. He stared at the door while the train rattled on, while his blood drained from his extremities. His brain reeled back from the lack of oxygen. Bright spots of light flashed in front of his vision, blotting out the atrocity, and then he fainted. He was unconscious when the train reached A Street. He was deaf to the driver's announcement that all travelers beyond that station would have to change trains. Had he heard this, he would have questioned the sense of it. No trains disgorged all their passengers at J Street. The line ran up to Mott Avenue via Aqueduct Racetrack, past JFK Airport. He would have asked what kind of train this could be, except he already knew. The truth was hanging in the next car. It was smiling contentedly to itself from behind a bloody chain mail apron. This was the midnight meat train. There's no accounting for time in a dead faint. It could have been seconds or hours that passed before Kaufman's eyes flickered open again, and his mind focused on his newfound situation. He lay under one of the seats now, sprawled across the vibrating wall of the car, hidden from view. Fate was with him so far, he thought. Somehow the rocking of the car must have jockeyed his unconscious body out of sight. He thought of the horror in car 2 and swallowed back vomit. He was alone. Wherever the guard was, murdered perhaps, there was no way he could call for help. And the driver? Was he dead at his controls? Was the train even now hurtling through an unknown tunnel, a tunnel without a single station to identify it towards its destruction? And if there was no crash to be killed in, there was always the butcher, still hacking away at a door's thickness from where Kaufman lay. Whichever way he turned, the name on the door was death. And the noise was deafening, especially lying on the floor. Kaufman's teeth were shaking in their sockets, and his face felt numb in the vibration. Even his skull was aching. Gradually he felt strength seeping back into his exhausted limbs. He cautiously stretched his fingers and clenched his fists and set the blood flowing there again. And as the feeling returned, so did the nausea. He kept seeing the grisly brutality of the next car. He'd seen photographs of murder victims before, of course, but these were no common murders. He was on the same train as the subway butcher, the monster who strung his victims up by the feet from the straps, hairless and naked. How long would it be before the killer stepped through that door and claimed him? He was sure that if the slaughterer didn't finish him, expectation would. He heard the movement beyond the door. instinct took over. Kaufman thrust himself further under the seat and tucked himself into a tiny ball, with his sick white face to the wall. Then he covered his head and his eyes, and closed his head with his hands and closed his eyes as tightly as any child in terror of the boogeyman. The door slid open. The rush of air from the rails. It smelled stranger than any coffin had smelled before, and colder. This was somehow primal, and the air of his nostrils made him shudder. The door closed. The butcher was close. Kaufman knew it. He could be standing no more than a matter of inches from where he lay. Was he even now looking down at Kaufman's back, even now bending, knife in hand, to scoop Kaufman from his hiding place like a snail hooked from its shell? Nothing happened. He felt no breath on his neck. His spine was not slit open. There was simply a clatter of feet close to Kaufman's head, and that same sound receding. Kaufman's breath held in his lungs till they hurt, expelled in a rasp between his teeth. Mahogany was almost disappointed that the sleeping man had alighted at West 4th Street. He was hoping for one more job to do that night, to keep him occupied while they descended. But no, the man had gone. The potential victim hadn't looked that healthy anyway, he thought to himself. He was an anemic Jewish accountant, probably. The meat wouldn't have been of any quality. Mahogany walked the length of the car to the driver's cabin. He spent the rest of the journey there. Christ, thought Kaufman. He's going to kill the driver. He heard the cabin door slide open. It was the voice of the butcher, low and hoarse. Hi. Hi. They knew each other. All done? All done. Kaufman was shocked by the banality of the exchange. All done? What does that mean, all done? He missed the next few words as the train hit a particularly noisy section of the track. Kaufman could resist no longer. Wearily he uncurled himself and glanced over his shoulder down the length of the car. All he could see was the butcher's legs at the bottom of the open cabin door. Damn, he wanted to see the monster's face again. There was laughter now. Kaufman calculated the risks of his situation, the mathematics of panic. If he remained where he was, sooner or later the butcher would glance down at him, and he'd be mincemeat. On the other hand, if he were to move from his hiding place, he would risk being seen and pursued. Which is worse, stasis and meeting his death, trapped in a hole, or making a break for it and confronting his maker in the middle of the car? Kaufman surprised himself with his mettle. He'd move. Infinitesimally slowly, he crawled out from under the seat, watching the butcher's back every minute he did so. Once out, he began to crawl towards the door. Each step he took was torment, but the butcher seemed far too engrossed with his conversation to turn around. Kaufman reached the door. He began to stand up, trying all the while to prepare himself for the sight he would meet in car 2. The handle was grasped. He slid the door open. The noise of the rails increased, and a wave of dank air, stinking of nothing but on earth, came up with him. Surely the butcher must hear or smell? But no. Kaufman skinned his way through the slit he had opened and through the bloody chamber beyond. Relief made him careless. He failed to latch the door properly and behind him, and it began to slide open with the buffeting of the train. Mahogany put his head out of the cabin and stared down the car towards the door. "What the fuck's that?" said the driver. He didn't close the door properly, that's all. Kaufman heard the butcher walking towards the door. He crouched, a ball of consternation, against the intersecting wall, suddenly aware of how full his bowels were. The door was pulled close from the other side, and the footsteps receded again. Safe, for another breath at last. Kaufman opened his eyes, steeling himself for the slaughter pen in front of him. There was no avoiding it. It filled every one of his senses. The smell of opened entrails, the sight of the bodies, the feel of the fluid on the floor under his fingers, the sound of the straps creaking beneath the weight of the corpses, even the air tasting salty with blood. He was with death absolutely in that cubby hole, hurtling in the dark. But there was no nausea now. There was no feeling left but a casual revulsion. He found himself peering at the bodies with some curiosity. The carcass closest to him was the remains of the pimply youth he had seen in Car 1. The body hung upside down, swinging back and forth to the rhythm of the train in unison with its three fellows, an obscene dance macabre. Its arms dangled loosely from the shoulder joints, into which gashes an inch or two deep had made, so the bodies would hang more neatly. Every part of the dead kid's anatomy was swaying hypnotically, the tongue hanging from the open mouth, the head lolling on its split neck, even the youth's penis flapped from side to side on its plucked groin. The head wound and the open jugular still pulsed blood into a black bucket. There was an elegance about the whole sight, the sign of a job well done. Beyond that, the body of the strung-up corpses of two young white women and a darker-skinned male. Kaufman turned his head on one side to look at their faces. They were quite blank. One of the girls was quite a beauty. He decided the male had been Puerto Rican. All were shorn of their head and body hair. In fact, the air was pungent with the smell of the shearing. Kaufman slid up the wall out of the crouching position. As he did so, one of the woman's bodies turned around, presenting a dorsal view. He was not prepared for this horror. The meat of her back had been entirely cleft open from neck to buttock, and the muscle had been peeled back to expose the glistening vertebrae. It was the final triumph of the butcher's craft. Here they hung, these shaved, blood and slit slabs of humanity opened up like fish and ripe for devouring. Kaufman almost smiled at the perfection of its horror. He felt an offer of insanity trickling at the base of his skull, tempting him into oblivion, promising a blank indifference to the world. He began to shake uncontrollably. He felt his vocal cords trying to form a scream. It was intolerable. Yet the scream was to become, in a short while, like the creatures in front of him. Fuck it, he said more loudly than he intended. Then, pushing himself off the wall, he began to walk down in the car between the swaying corpses, observing the neat piles of clothes and belongings that sat on the seats beside their owners. Under his feet, the floor was sticky with drying bile. Even his eyes closed to the cracks, he could see the blood in the bucket so clearly. It was thick and heady, flecks of grit turning it in. He was past the youth now, and he could see the door into car 3 ahead. All he had to do was run this gauntlet of atrocities. He urged himself on, trying to ignore the horrors and to concentrate on the door that would lead him back to sanity. He was past the first woman. A few more yards, he said to himself. 10 steps at most, less if he walked with confidence. Then the lights went out. Jesus Christ, he said. The train lurched, and Kaufman lost his balance. In the utter blackness, he reached out for support, and his flailing arms encompassed the body beside him. Before he could prevent himself, he felt his hands sinking into the lukewarm flesh, his fingers grasping open edge of muscle on the dead woman's back, his fingertips touching the bone of her spine. His cheek was laid against the bald flesh of the thigh. He screamed, and even as he screamed, the lights flickered back on. And as they flickered back on, his scream died. He heard the noise of the butcher's feet approaching down the length the car, one towards the intervening door. He let go of the body he was embracing. He was smeared with blood from her leg. He could feel it on his cheek, like war paint. The scream had cleared Coffin's head, and he suddenly felt relief, at least in a kind of strength. There would be no pursuit down the train, he knew that, and there would be no cowardice, not now. This was going to be a primitive confrontation, two human beings face to face, and then there would be no trick, none. He couldn't contemplate using to bring his enemy down. This was a matter of survival, pure and simple. Door handle rattled. Coffin looked around for a weapon, his eyes sturdy and calculating. His gaze fell upon the pile of clothes beside the Puerto Rican's body. There was a knife there, lying amongst the rhinestone rings and the imitation gold chains. A long-bladed, immaculately clean weapon, probably the man's pride and joy. Reaching past the well-muscled body, Coffin plucked a knife from the heap. It felt good in his hand. It felt positively thrilling. The door was opening, and the face of the slaughterer came into view. Coffin looked down the arbitrary mahogany. He was not terribly fearsome, just another balding, overweight man of 50. His face was heavy, and his eyes deep-set. His mouth was rather small and delicately lipped. In fact, he had a woman's mouth. Mahogany could not understand where this intruder had appeared from. He was aware that it was another oversight, another sign of increasing competence. He must dispatch this ragged creature immediately. After all, they could not be more than a mile or two from the end of the line. He must have cut the little man down and have him hanging by his heels before they reached their destination. He moved into car 2. You were asleep, he said, recognizing Coffin. I saw you. Coffin said nothing. You should have left the train. What were you trying to do? Hide from me? Coffin kept his silence. Mahogany grasped the hand of the cleaver hanging from his well-used leather belt. It was dirty with blood, as was his chainmail apron, his hammer, and his saw. As it is, I'll have to do away with you. Coffin raised the knife. It looked a little small beside the butcher's paraphernalia. Fuck it, he said. Mahogany grinned at the little man's pretensions to defense. You shouldn't have seen this. It's not for the likes of you, he said, taking another step towards Coffin. It's a secret. Oh, so he's a divinely inspired type, is he? Thought Coffin. That explains something. Fuck it, he said again. The butcher frowned. He didn't like the little man's indifference to his work, his reputation. We all have to die sometime, he said. You should be well pleased. You're not going to be burnt up like most of them. I could use you to feed the fathers. Coffin's only response was a grin. He was being terrorized by this gross, shambling hulk. The butcher unhooked the cleaver from his belt and brandished it. A dirty little Jew like you should be thankful to be useful at all. It means the best you can aspire to. Without warning, the butcher swung. The cleaver divided the air at some speed, but Coffin stepped back. The cleaver sliced his coat arm and buried itself in the Puerto Rican's shank. The impact half severed the leg, and the weight of the body opened the gash even further. The exposed meat of the thigh was like a prime steak, succulent and appetizing. The butcher started to drag the cleaver out of the wound, and in that moment, Coffin sprang. The knife sped towards Mahogany's eye, but an error in judgment buried it instead in his neck. It transfixed to the column and appeared in the little gout of gore on the other side, straight through, in one stroke, straight through. Mahogany felt the blade in his neck as a choking sensation, almost as though he had caught a chicken bone in his throat. It made a ridiculous, half-hearted coughing sound. Blood issued from his lips, painting them like lipstick on his woman's mouth. And the cleaver clattered to the floor. Coffin pulled out the knife. The two wounds spouted little arcs of blood. Mahogany collapsed to his knees, staring at the knife that had killed him. The little man was watching him quite passively. He was saying something. Mahogany's ears were deaf to the remarks, as though he was underwater. Mahogany suddenly went blind. He knew with a little nostalgia for his senses that he would not see or hear again. This was death. It was on him for certain. His hands felt the weave of his trousers, however, and the hot splashes of his skin. His life seemed to totter on his tiptoes while his fingers grasped at one last sense. Then his body collapsed, and his hands and his life, and his sacred duty folded up under a weight of gray flesh. The butcher was dead. Coffin dragged gulps of stale air into his lungs and grabbed one of the straps to steady his reeling body. Tears blotted out the shambles he stood in. Time passed. He didn't know how long. He was lost in a dream of victory. Then the train began to slow. He felt and heard the brakes being applied. The hanging bodies lurched forward as the curving train slowed and its wheels squealing on the rails that were sweating slime. Curiosity overtook Coffin. Would the train shunt into the butcher's underground slaughterhouse, decorated with the meats he had gathered throughout his career? And the laughing driver, so indifferent to the massacre, would he do once the train would stop? Whatever happened now was academic. He could face anything at all, watch and see. Tenai cackled, the voice of the driver. We're here, man. Better take your place, eh? Take your place? What does that even mean? The train slowed to a snail's pace. Outside the windows, everything was dark as ever. Lights flickered, then went out. This time they didn't come back on. Coffin was left in total darkness. We'll be out in half an hour, the tenor announced, so like any station report. The train had come to a stop. The sound of its wheels on the tracks, the rush of the passage which Coffin had grown used to, were suddenly absent. All he could hear was the hum of the tenor. He could still see nothing at all. Then a hiss. The doors were opening. A smell entered the car, a smell so caustic that Coffin clapped his hand over his face to shut it out. Yeah, he stood in silence, hand to mouth, for what seemed like a lifetime. See no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. There was a flicker of light outside the window. It threw the door frame into a silhouette, and it grew stronger by the degrees. Soon there was sufficient light in the car for Coffin to see the crumpled body of the butcher at his feet, and several sides of meat hanging from every side of him. There was a whisper, too, from the dark outside the train, a gathering of tiny voices like the voices of beetles. In the tunnel, shuffling towards the train, were human beings. Coffin could see their outlines now. Some of them carried torches, which burned with a dead brown light. The noise was perhaps their feet on the damp earth, perhaps their tongues clicking, or both. Coffin wasn't as naive as he had been here an hour before. Could there be any doubt as to the intention that these things had coming out of the blackness towards the train? The butcher had slaughtered the men and women to eat for these cannibals, and they were coming like diners at a dinner gong to eat at his restaurant car. Coffin bent down and picked up the cleaver the butcher had dropped. The noise of the creature's approach was louder every moment. He backed down the car away from the open doors, only to find that the doors behind him were also open, and there was a whisper of approach there too. He shrank back against one of the seats and was about to take refuge under them when a hand, small, thin, and frail, to the point of transparency, appeared around the door. He could not look away, not that terror froze him as it had at the window. He simply wanted to watch. The creature stepped into the car. The torches behind it threw its face into shadow, but its outline could be clearly seen. There was nothing remarkable about it. It had 2 arms and 2 legs as he did. Its head was not abnormally shaped. The body was small, and the effort of climbing into the train made its breath coarse. It seemed more geriatric than psychotic. Generations of fictional man-eaters had not prepared him for its distressing vulnerability. Behind it, similar creatures were appearing out of the darkness, shuffling into the train. In fact, they were coming in at every door. Kaufman was trapped. He weighed the cleaver in his hands, getting in the bounds of it, ready for the battle with these antique monsters. The torch had been brought into the car, and it illuminated the faces of the leaders. They were completely bald. The tired flesh of their faces was pulled tight over their skull slits shone with tension. There were stains of decay and disease on their skin, and in places the muscle had withered to a black pus, as though through which the bone of the cheek or the temple was showering. Some of them were naked as babies, their pulping syphilitic bodies scarcely sexed. Had been breasts for leathery bags hanging off the torso. Genitalia shrunk from the way. Besides, the naked amongst them were those who wore a veil of clothes. It soon dawned on Kaufman that the rotting fabric slung around their shoulders or not about their midriffs was made of human skins. Not one, but a dozen or more, heaped haphazardly on top of each other like pathetic trophies. The leaders of this grotesque meal line had reached the bodies now, and graceful hands laid upon the shanks of meat and were running up and down the shaved flesh in a manner that suggested sensual pleasure. Tongues were dancing out of mouths, flecks of spittle landing on the meat. The eyes of the monsters were flicking back and forth with hunger and excitement. Eventually one of them saw Kaufman. Its eyes stopped flickering from him. It fixed on him. A look of inquiry came over its face, making a parody of puzzlement. You! The voice was as wasted as the lips it came from. Kaufman raised the cleaver a little, calculating his chances. There were perhaps 30 of them in the car and many more outside. But they looked so weak, and they had no weapons but their skin and bones. The monster spoke again, its voice quite well modulated, when it found itself, the piping of a once cultured, once charming man. We came after the other, yes? I glanced down at the body of Mahogany. It had clearly taken in the situation very quickly. Well, anyway, it said, its watering eyes back on Kaufman, studying him with care. Fuck you, said Kaufman. The creature attempted a wry smile, but had almost forgotten the technique. And the result was a grimace which exposed a mouthful of teeth that had been systematically filed into points. You must do this for us, it said through the bestial grin. We cannot survive without food. The hand patted the rump of human flesh. Kaufman had no reply to the idea. He just stared in disgust as the female fingernail slid between the cleft in the buttocks, filling the tender swell of tender muscle. It disgusts us no less than you, but we're bound to eat this meat or we die. God knows I have no appetite for it. The thing was drooling nevertheless. Kaufman found his voice. It was small, with more confusion of feelings than with fear. What are you? Are you accidents of some kind? We are the city fathers, and the mothers, and the daughters, and the sons, the builders, lawmakers. We made the city. New York? Said Kaufman. House of the lights? Before you were born, for anyone living was born. As it spoke, the creature's fingernails were running up under the skin of the split body and were peeling the thin, elastic layer off the luscious brawn. Behind Kaufman, other creatures had begun to unhook the bodies from the straps, their hands laid in the same delighting manner on the smooth breasts and flanks of flesh. These too had begun skinning the meat. You'll bring us more meat from us. The other was weak. Kaufman stared in disbelief. Me? Feed you? What do you think I am? You must do it for us, for those older than us, for those born before the city was thought of, when America was a timberland desert. The fragile hand gestured out of the train. Kaufman's gaze followed the pointing finger into the gloom. There was something else outside the train he'd failed to see before, much bigger than anything human. The pack of creatures parted to let Kaufman through so he could inspect more closely whatever it was that stood outside. His feet would not move. Go on, said the father. Kaufman thought of the city he loved. Were these really its ancients, its philosophers, its creators? He had to believe it. Perhaps there were people on the surface, bureaucrats, politicians, and authorities of every kind, who knew this terrible secret and whose lives were dedicated to preserving these abominations, feeding them as savage feed lambs to their gods. There was a horrible familiarity about this ritual. Rang a bell, not in Kaufman's conscious mind, but in his deeper, older self. His feet no longer obeying his mind, but his instinct to worship moved. He walked through the corridor of bodies and stepped out of the train. The light of the torches scarcely began to illuminate the limitless darkness outside. The air seemed solid, it was so thick with the smell of ancient earth. But Kaufman smelt nothing. His head bowed. It was all he could do to prevent himself from fainting again. It was there, the precursor of man, the original American whose homeland was this before Passamaquoddy or Cayenne. Its eyes, if it had any, were on him. His body shook, his teeth chattered. He could hear the noise of its anatomy, ticking, cackling, sobbing. It shifted a little in the dark. The sound of its movement was awesome, like a mountain sitting up. Kaufman's face raised to it without thinking about what he was doing or why. He fell to his knees in the shit in front of the Father of Fathers. Every day of his life had been leading up to this very day, every moment getting to this incalculable moment of holy terror. Had there been sufficient light in that pit to see the whole, perhaps his tepid heart would have burst. As it was, he felt it flutter in his chest as he saw what he saw. It was a giant, without head or limb, without feature that was analogous to human, without organ that made sense or senses. If it was like anything, it was like a shoal of fish, or 1,000 snouts all moving in unison, budding, blossoming, and withering rhythmically. It was iridescent, like mother of pearl, but was sometimes deeper than any color Kaufman knew or could put a name to. This was all Kaufman could see, and was more than he wanted to see. There was much more in the darkness, flickering and flapping. He could look no longer. He turned away, and as he did so, a football was pitched out of the train and rolled to a halt in front of the father. At least he thought it was a football, until he peered more tentatively at it, and recognized it as a human head, the head of the butcher. The skin of its face had been pulled off in strips. It glistened with blood as it lay in front of its lord. Kaufman looked away, walked back to the train. Every part of his body seemed to be weeping but his eyes. They were too hot with the side behind him. They boiled his tears away. Outside, the creatures already set about their supper. One he saw was plucking the blue sweet morsel of a woman's eye out of the socket, another hand in his mouth. At Coffin's feet lay the butcher's headless corpse, pulsating profusely, where its neck had been bitten through. The little father who had spoken earlier stood in front of the coffin. "Serve us," he asked gently, "as you might ask a cow to follow you." Kaufman was staring at the cleaver, the butcher's symbol of office. The creatures were leaving the car now, dragging the half-eaten bodies after them. As the torches were taken out of the car, darkness was returning, but before the lights had completely disappeared, the father reached out into Kaufman's face, thrusting him round to look at himself in the filthy glass of the car window. It was a thin reflection, but Kaufman could see quite well how changed he was, more than any living man should be, covered in grime and blood. The father's hand still gripped Kaufman's face, its forefinger hooked into his mouth and down his gullet, the fingers scouring the back of his throat. Kaufman gagged on the intruder, but had no will left to repel the attack. "Serve," said the creature, "and silence." Too late, Kaufman realized the intention of the fingers. Suddenly his tongue was seized tight and twisted on the root. Kaufman, in shock, dropped the cleaver. He tried to scream, but no sound came. Blood was in his throat. He heard his flesh tearing. His agonies convulsed him. Then the hand was out of his mouth, and the scarlet spittle-covered fingers were in front of his face, with his tongue held between thumb and forefinger. Kaufman was speechless. "Serve," said the father, and stuffed the tongue into his own mouth, chewing it with evident satisfaction. Kaufman fell to his knees, spitting up his sandwich. The father was already shuffling away into the dark. The rest of the ancients had disappeared into the warren for another night. Tenoi cackled. "Home," said the driver. The doors hissed closed, and the sound of power surged through the train. The lights flickered on, then off again, then on. The train began to move. Kaufman lay on the floor, tears pouring down his face, tears of discomfiture and resignation. He would bleed to death, he decided, where he lay. It wouldn't matter if he died. It was a foul world anyway. The driver woke him. He opened his eyes. The face that was looking down at him was black, but not unfriendly. It grinned. Kaufman tried to say something, but his mouth was sealed up with dried blood. He jerked his head around like a driveler trying to spit out a word. Nothing came out but grunts. He wasn't dead. He hadn't bled to death. The driver pulled him up to his knees, talking to him as though he were a 3-year-old. "You got a job to do, my man. They're very pleased with you." The driver had licked his fingers and was rubbing Kaufman's swollen lips, trying to part them. "Lots to learn before tomorrow night. Lots to learn, lots to learn." He led Kaufman out of the train. There was no station he had ever seen before. It was white-tiled and absolutely pristine, where station keepers, Nirvana. No graffiti disfigured the walls, no token booths, but then there were no gates and no passengers either. There was a line that provided only one service, the meat train. The morning shift of cleaners were already busy hosing the blood off the seats and the floor of the train. Somebody was stripping the butcher's body in preparation to dispatch to New Jersey. All around Kaufman, people were at work. A rain of light was pouring through a grating in the roof of the station. Motes of dust hung in the beams, turning over and over. Kaufman watched them entranced. He hadn't seen such beautiful things since he was a child. Lovely dust, over and over and over and over. The driver had managed to separate Kaufman's lips. His mouth was too wounded for him to move it. At least he could breathe easily, and the pain was already beginning to subside. The driver smiled at him and turned to the rest of the workers in the station. "I'd like to introduce Mahogany's replacement, our new butcher," he announced. The workers looked at Coffin. There was a certain deference in their faces which he found appealing. Coffin looked up at the sunlight falling all around him. He jerked his head, signifying he wanted to go up into the open air. The driver nodded and led him to a steep flight of steps and through an alleyway so out on the sidewalk. It was a beautiful day. The bright sky over New York was streaked with filaments of pale pink cloud, and the air smelled of morning. The streets and avenues were practically empty. At a distance, an occasional cab crossed an intersection, its engine a whisper. Runners sweated on the other side of the street. Very soon, these deserted sidewalks would be thronged with people. The city would go about its business in ignorance, never knowing what it was built upon, or what it owed its life to. Without hesitation, Kaufman fell to his knees and kissed the dirty concrete with his bloody lips, silently swearing his eternal loyalty to its countenance. The Palace of Delights received the torsion without comment.